There was a time when rent of $400 in inner southeast Portland got you not just a roof, but a shot at afternoons in Powell's, late nights at house shows, and mornings when Stumptown was your living room, before tech money and leases for $1,800 crowded in. You remember the feeling, real breathing room to make art, play music, or just exist without always looking over your shoulder. But even in that golden era, warning signs flickered, with homelessness under bridges, treasured neighbors pushed out, and the first ripples of change. What did Portland really feel like before everything shifted? And what happened to the version of the city that some say we lost for good? Powell's wasn't just a bookstore, it was a city in itself. A full block of shelves and stairways where you could lose an entire afternoon and run into half the people you knew. The air always held a mix of paper, coffee, and rain-soaked coats. If you were broke, you could still wander for hours, flipping through zines in the Red Room or catching a free reading upstairs. The staff didn't hover, and nobody cared if you camped out with a stack of books you couldn't afford. In the late 1990s, when rent for a one-bedroom hovered around $500, Powell's became the unofficial living room of Portland's creative class. Writers, painters, musicians, and service workers who might spend their last few dollars on a used novel or a battered poetry collection. A few blocks away, in 1999, Stumptown Coffee opened its first cafe on Southeast Division. It didn't take long for it to feel like the city's new living room. The baristas pulled shots behind the counter while regulars filled every seat, sketchbooks and lyric sheets spread across tables. You could nurse a single cup of coffee for hours, and no one would ask you to leave. It was the kind of place where you might overhear plans for a new zine, a band rehearsal, or a late-night film screening. These public rooms, Powell's, Stumptown, and a constellation of smaller cafes, became the connective tissue of the city. They weren't just spots to pass time, they were where friendships sparked, ideas took root, and whole scenes began. Back then, the price of entry was low, a few bucks for coffee, a part-time job, and the time to linger. Down in the basements and cramped living rooms of Southeast Portland, the city's music scene thrived on nothing but cheap rent, borrowed amps, and a willingness to squeeze 50 people into a space meant for 10. Most nights, you could wander Hawthorne or Belmont and catch a house show. No bouncer, no cover, just a handwritten flyer taped to a lamppost. Bands like Heat Miser, Quasi, and a rotating cast of punk kids played sets that shook the floorboards loose. The audience was close enough to feel every chord, and the ceiling was always a little too low. Sometimes the band slept on the same couch you'd just spilled your beer on. If you had a 4-track recorder and a few friends, you could make an album in your basement. But for those chasing something bigger, there was Jackpot. Recording Studio, opened by Larry Crane in 1997. It was tucked behind a nondescript storefront on Southeast Morrison, but inside, Elliott Smith tracked parts of Either Or, an album that would echo far beyond Portland. For a few $100, you could book a night at Jackpot, record straight to tape, and walk out with a demo that might actually get played on KBOO or college radio. There was no industry gatekeeper, just a steady hum of ambition and possibility. The city's music circuit ran on word of mouth and trust. You'd meet someone at a show, swap numbers, and by next week, your band was booked in a stranger's basement across town. There was enough time to rehearse, enough space to experiment, and enough breathing room that making art didn't have to be a gamble. In those years, Portland felt like a place where anyone could start something, and most nights, someone did. On a weekday morning, you could step out your front door in Sunnyside or Richmond and feel the city open up in every direction. Hawthorne Boulevard stretched out like a parade of vintage shops, record stores, and battered neon signs. The Baghdad Theater's marquee always promised a second-run film for a few bucks, and the sidewalks buzzed with neighbors carrying groceries, guitars, or just walking their dogs. Division Street had its own rhythm, old houses tucked behind wild gardens, Thai and Vietnamese restaurants with handwritten lunch specials, and the first hints of what would become a new food scene. People knew each other by sight, if not by name. The same faces showed up at the corner market, the laundromat, or biking past with a milk crate strapped to the back. But the real magic was how close the city felt to the wild. You could finish a shift at the cafe, hop on your bike, and be under the trees of Forest Park in less than half an hour. 5,000 acres of trails and moss right at the city's edge, big enough to get lost, quiet enough to hear your own footsteps. On weekends, friends piled into beat-up Subarus and headed for the gorge, where Multnomah Falls crashed down through ferns and mist, or out to the coast for foggy afternoons and salt air. The Willamette River cut through downtown, with Tom McCall Waterfront Park offering miles of green space and a front-row seat to every festival and protest the city could dream up. This was a Portland where the boundaries between city and nature blurred. The streets were walkable, the parks felt endless, and the sense of possibility came not just from what you could do, but from how close everything was. Neighbors, music, forest, and the next adventure, all within reach. Tents began to cluster under the Burnside Bridge and along the railroad tracks, a stubborn reminder that not everyone could find a place in the city's easy-going dream. You remember the blue tarps, the shopping carts, the handwritten signs asking for change. Even during the years when rent felt manageable for some, shelters filled up fast, and waiting lists for addiction treatment stretched for months. City budgets for mental health and housing support rarely kept pace with need. $10 million a year barely scratched the surface. In North and Northeast, the promise of urban renewal arrived with the Interstate Corridor Plan, but property taxes climbed, and longtime black families found themselves pushed out, their houses replaced by condos and vacant lots. The city's creative spirit thrived in coffee shops and clubs. But just blocks away, the cost of belonging was quietly rising. The people who built that world were artists, musicians, cooks, and the baristas who learned your name. They slowly disappeared as rents climbed past what a part-time paycheck could handle. The muralists, the record store clerks, the small cafe owners who made room for wandering poets found themselves priced out by the very momentum they helped set in motion. You remember an older barista at Stumptown, still behind the counter as the city changed around her, pouring coffee for new faces while old regulars faded away. The city kept moving, but something essential slipped quietly out the door with them. Portland's old breathing room is gone. Median rent now tops $1,600, and longtime neighbors are scattered. But every new mural, food cart, or open mic still echoes those years when possibility felt cheap. The real question is, what would it take to make space for that kind of hope again? Share your memories below.